The first thing I saw when I stepped outside that morning was a neon pink Kia Soul parked dead center in my driveway. It wasn't mine. I didn't know whose it was. And worse, it was parked so perfectly, so obnoxiously, that it blocked my garage entirely. I couldn't even back my truck out if I wanted to. I took a deep breath, counted to 5, thought maybe, just maybe, this was a mistake. But deep down, I knew better. I turned around and there she was, standing on the sidewalk like she had been waiting for me, arms crossed, her signature smug grin stretching across her overly powdered face. Karen. The self-appointed dictator of our HOA. She tilted her head and gestured toward the Kia like she was showing off a new sculpture. You like it? She chirped. I blinked. What? The new community parking initiative. We had our HOA meeting last night. If you had attended, you'd know that underutilized private driveways are now designated for overflow parking. It's in the handbook. I stared at her, then at the car, then back at her again. My brain refused to process the insanity. You're telling me you just took my driveway? Oh, it's not just you, she said, waving her hands like she was spreading fairy dust. It's a community effort. We have so many guests visiting and, well, it's only fair that everyone does their part. I ran a hand down my face. Karen, that's not how property works. She smiled wider, and I swear I could hear my blood pressure rising. Oh, but it is. See, we reviewed the fine print of the HOA agreement. You agreed to reasonable accommodations for community benefit when you moved in. That means shared parking rights on underutilized spaces. I gestured at my garage, which I now couldn't even access. It's not underutilized. It's my damn driveway. She clucked her tongue like I was a child who didn't understand the rules of the playground. Well, you weren't using it at this exact moment, were you? I had never wanted to punt a human being into the sun so badly in my life. Move the car, Karen. Can't, she said cheerfully. That one belongs to the Johnsons' niece. She's visiting from out of town. Sweet girl. She'll be here for 2 weeks. I took another deep breath, trying to suppress the violent urges bubbling up inside me. You mean to tell me that I won't be able to use my own driveway for 2 weeks? She beamed. Exactly. See? Now you're getting it. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again, then simply turned around and went inside. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, I attended my very first HOA meeting in years. It was exactly as miserable as I expected. Karen stood at the head of the community clubhouse, speaking into a cheap microphone like she was some kind of president giving a State of the Union address. As we move forward with these progressive community guidelines, she was saying, it's important that we all remember, cooperation is key. I cleared my throat loudly. Excuse me. Yeah. Question. Karen's face soured as she looked at me. Oh, Mr. Mitchell. So glad you could join us. Yeah. Hey, quick thing. Since when does the HOA get to claim private property? There was a murmur of nervous shuffling from the other neighbors, most of whom looked like they would rather be anywhere but here. Karen sighed like she was dealing with a particularly slow student. Oh, Jake, you really should have read your agreement before moving in. Oh, I read it, I shot back. And nowhere does it say you can just steal my driveway. She laughed, that condescending little chuckle that made my fists clench. It's not stealing, Jake. It's reallocating resources. For the good of the community. I turned to the other homeowners. And you guys are just okay with this? What happens when it's your driveway next? More nervous shifting. A few people looked away. A couple of them gave me apologetic shrugs, the kind that said, we hate it too, but what can we do? Karen gave me a sugary sweet smile. Oh, don't be dramatic. It's just parking. The rage was starting to set in. Karen, I swear. She waved a hand. Meeting adjourned. Now, let's all remember to be neighborly, okay? I left that meeting knowing one thing for sure. There was no reasoning with Karen. If I wanted my driveway back, I was going to have to play dirty. The next morning, I called a tow truck. The driver showed up, ready to haul the neon pink nightmare out of my driveway. Just as he was about to hook it up, Karen came sprinting out of her house, bathrobe flapping, phone in hand. "I'm calling the police," she shrieked. The tow driver looked at me. Karen shoved her phone in my face. "It is illegal to tow a vehicle that is part of a community initiative." "That's not a real law," I said flatly. She smirked. "No, but it is an HOA policy. And you signed the agreement." I clenched my teeth. "So I'm just supposed to let people park in my driveway forever?" "Oh no, of course not," she said sweetly. "You can submit a formal request for reconsideration. The board will review it at next month's meeting." I stared at her. "You've got to be kidding me." She winked. "Patience is a virtue, Jake." The tow driver shook his head, clearly wanting no part of this mess, and left. I was officially out of options. At least, I was out of the reasonable ones. That night, I sat in my garage, sipping a beer and glaring at the pink Kia. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my old army buddy Luke. "Luke, hey man, you still got that crazy restoration project? The one from the base?" I stared at the message, the wheels in my head turning. A slow, devious grin spread across my face. "Jake, yeah. Why?" "Luke, no reason. Just had an idea." I leaned back in my chair, cracking my knuckles. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I was more than happy to oblige. By the time I went to bed that night, my mind was made up. I was going to get my driveway back. And I was going to do it with a tank. The moment I made up my mind, I knew there was no turning back. Karen had declared war on my driveway, and if she wanted a battle, I was going to bring the biggest weapon I had. Literally. I picked up the phone and called Luke. It rang twice before he picked up. "So, you're actually considering it?" he asked, already knowing what this was about. "I'm done playing nice," I said. "I want my driveway back." There was a pause, and then Luke burst out laughing. "You do realize what you're about to do is completely insane, right?" "Absolutely," I replied. "And that's why it's going to work." Luke let out a long whistle. "All right, man. You got a way to transport it." "I'll figure it out," I said. "Just tell me it's still in good condition." "Good condition?" Luke scoffed. "It's a beast. Needs a little love, but she'll still roll. And more importantly, it's legal. You made sure of that when you restored it." That was true. The tank had been a long-abandoned project from our army days, something I had spent years restoring piece by piece. The engine was gutted, meaning it wasn't technically a functioning vehicle anymore, just a big, heavy, intimidating hunk of steel. And according to everything I had checked, it was completely legal to own and display on private property. I spent the next few hours making calls, pulling every string I had to arrange for transport. Most companies either laughed at me or thought I was joking, but eventually, I found one guy who was just crazy enough to take the job. By the next afternoon, everything was set. The tank was officially on its way. The day it arrived was something straight out of a movie. The entire neighborhood gathered on their porches as a massive flatbed truck rolled down the street, carrying the weathered yet still imposing M60 patent tank. Kids ran out onto their lawns, pointing and shouting. Parents stood slack-jawed, unsure if they should be impressed or terrified. Even the usual HOA enforcers, the ones who loved handing out petty fines, didn't know what to do with themselves. And then there was Karen. She came sprinting out of her house the moment she saw it, her mouth already moving before her brain had time to catch up. "What is that?" she screeched, her voice echoing across the cul-de-sac. I folded my arms, looking up at my new lawn ornament as the truck carefully backed it into my driveway. "Oh, just a little something to deter unauthorized parking." Karen's face twisted into a mask of fury. "You can't be serious." I shrugged. "Your rules, Karen. My property is now community parking, right? So I figured I needed something to make sure people respect it." Her eyes nearly popped out of her head. "You can't just put a tank in your driveway." I grinned. "Oh, but I can." And I did. The driver gave me a thumbs up as the tank was carefully unloaded, its treads settling firmly onto the pavement. The whole thing was a beauty, big, intimidating, and an absolute nightmare for anyone who thought about using my driveway as their personal parking lot. I leaned against it, feeling victorious. Karen was fuming. "This is against HOA regulations," she shouted. I pulled out the HOA handbook, the same one she had used to justify stealing my driveway. "Actually, it's not. Nowhere does it say I can't park a historical display on my own property." She grabbed at the book, flipping through the pages like she could somehow manifest a rule that didn't exist. When she found nothing, she let out an enraged shriek. "This is a safety hazard." "Nope," I said. "Not operational. It's a display piece. Just like that ridiculous fountain you put in the middle of the cul-de-sac last year." "That was an improvement to the neighborhood," she snapped. "And this," I said, patting the side of the tank, "is an improvement to my driveway." Karen's jaw clenched so tight I thought she might crack a tooth. "I'll have this removed." "You go ahead and try," I said. "You'll find out real quick how legal this is." She stormed off, whipping out her phone as she marched back to her house. I had no doubt she was calling every HOA board member, lawyer, and possibly even the National Guard to try and get the tank removed. But I had done my homework. The tank was mine, and there wasn't a single thing in her ridiculous HOA rulebook that could do a thing about it. That night, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. People I had barely spoken to before came up to shake my hand, laughing and whispering about how this was the greatest thing to ever happen to the community. Even the people who normally kept their heads down, afraid of Karen's wrath, were excited. It felt like, for the first time, someone had actually stood up to the tyranny of the HOA. But I wasn't foolish enough to think Karen would give up that easily. The next morning, I woke up to find an official-looking letter taped to my front door. I peeled it off and skimmed the contents, already knowing what it was before I even finished reading. The HOA was now claiming that the tank violated multiple community standards, including unsightly appearance, inappropriate military symbolism, and excessive noise pollution. I snorted. Noise pollution? The thing didn't even run. The letter ended with an ultimatum. Remove the tank within 48 hours, or face a $10,000 fine. I crumpled the paper in my fist. Karen was playing dirty, but she had underestimated just how stubborn I could be. I grabbed my phone and called Luke. "They're trying to find me." He laughed. "Of course they are. You think Karen's going to admit defeat that easily? I need to shut this down before she finds a way to actually make this stick." There was a pause on the other end. Then Luke said, "You remember that little loophole in the historic preservation laws?" I sat up straight. "The one about landmark status?" "Bingo," he said. "If that tank gets recognized as a historical landmark, the HOA can't touch it." I grinned. "Luke, you're a genius. That's why you keep me around," he said. "Now get to work. You've got a tank to protect." I wasted no time. I gathered every document I had on the tank's history, submitted an application for historic preservation status, and made a few calls to some military history organizations. It was a long shot, but if I could pull it off, the HOA would be completely powerless to do anything about it. By the time the sun set that evening, I was feeling more confident than ever. Karen might have thought she was the queen of the neighborhood, but she was about to learn the hard way that she had picked the wrong driveway to mess with, and I wasn't about to back down. The next morning, I woke up early and walked out to my driveway, stretching as I admired the absurdity of what I had done. The tank sat there in all its glory, casting a massive shadow over the pavement, and for the first time in days, my driveway was completely clear of unwanted vehicles. Not a single car had dared to park there overnight. It was almost peaceful. Almost. I didn't even get a chance to sip my morning coffee before I saw Karen power walking towards my house, HOA clipboard in hand, a determined scowl on her face. I sighed, bracing myself for whatever nonsense she was about to throw at me next. "You think this is funny?" she barked the second she reached my driveway. I took a slow sip of my coffee. Oh, I don't think it's funny, Karen. I think it's effective. She jabbed a finger at the tank like she was pointing out a dangerous animal. This monstrosity is unacceptable. The board has received multiple complaints, and we are issuing an emergency order for its removal. I smirked. Multiple complaints, huh? Let me guess, all from you. Her eye twitched. That is not relevant. The fact remains that this violates community standards. I pulled out my phone and casually scrolled to my emails. Actually, Karen, I just got word this morning. My petition for historic preservation? Approved. As of today, this tank is officially recognized as a historical landmark. Karen's face drained of color. You're lying. I turned my phone screen towards her. She snatched her reading glasses from the top of her head and squinted at the official government document displayed on my screen. Her lips moved silently as she read, her breathing getting shallower by the second. This is a joke, she finally spat. No joke, I said. Which means your little emergency order doesn't mean squat. The tank stays. She let out a strangled noise, somewhere between a gasp and a growl. You can't just manipulate the system like this. I shrugged. I learned from the best. Didn't you say something about reading the fine print? Her mouth opened and closed like a malfunctioning robot. I could see the gears in her head turning, frantically trying to find some loophole, some last-ditch attempt to regain control. But there was nothing she could do. Not anymore. I will not allow this, she finally hissed. You hear me, Jake? This isn't over. I sighed. Karen, it's already over. You lost. She stormed off without another word, practically vibrating with fury. I watched her go, savoring the moment, but I knew she wouldn't accept defeat that easily. She was going to try something else. She always did. Sure enough, the next day, an emergency HOA board meeting was called. I didn't even have to attend to know what it was about. The agenda was clear. Find a way to undo my victory. Luke and I sat in my garage, listening to the sounds of arguing voices from the clubhouse down the street. Think she's gonna try and rewrite the bylaws? Luke asked, tossing a beer can between his hands. Absolutely, I said. It's the only move she has left. We both knew Karen wouldn't accept losing. If the rules didn't work in her favor, she would change them until they did. But the thing about dictators is, sooner or later, people get tired of them. Sure enough, just as the meeting wrapped up, I saw something incredible happening. A crowd of neighbors, more than I had ever seen before, started gathering on the sidewalk outside the clubhouse. They were talking, murmuring amongst themselves, shaking their heads. Luke nudged me. Looks like you're not the only one who's had enough. Karen emerged from the clubhouse, smug as ever, clearly thinking she had just solidified her power once again. But the moment she saw the crowd, that smugness started to fade. People were waiting for her, watching her, and they didn't look happy. An older man, Mr. Patterson, stepped forward. He had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, long before Karen had taken over the HOA. Karen, he said, his voice steady, we're tired of this. Karen frowned. Tired of what? Tired of you running this HOA like your personal kingdom, he said. The tank was just the last straw. You've been pulling stunts like this for years. Karen's lips curled in disbelief. I do what's best for this community. No, a woman in the crowd said. You do what's best for you. The murmurs grew louder. People nodded. Karen started to look nervous. You changed the rules whenever it suited you, Mr. Patterson continued. You fined people for nonsense. You bullied anyone who didn't agree with you. And now, you tried to take away someone's driveway because you thought you could get away with it. She held up her clipboard like a shield. That's not true. I was following regulations. Regulations you made up, another voice called. You've turned this neighborhood into a nightmare, someone else shouted. Karen's face turned bright red. I have done nothing but work to keep this community running smoothly. If you don't like the way things are, then step down, Mr. Patterson interrupted. Because we're done with you. The crowd went silent. Karen stared at him, eyes wide. What? You heard me, he said. We're voting you out. Karen laughed, but it was the nervous, hollow kind. You can't just vote me out. I'm the HOA president. Not anymore, he said. We took a vote while you were inside. The majority has spoken. You're out. Karen turned in a frantic circle, looking for support, but none of her usual enforcers were there to back her up. The same people who had always nodded along with her nonsense were now looking away, unwilling to meet her eyes. The tide had turned. Her hands clenched at her sides. You can't do this. But they already had. She stormed away, marching straight to her house, slamming the door so hard that the windows rattled. The crowd slowly began to disperse, murmurs of relief and satisfaction in the air. Luke let out a low whistle. Damn. I almost feel bad for her. I smirked. Almost. A few neighbors approached me, shaking my hand, thanking me for standing up. It was strange, being the reluctant hero of the neighborhood, but I had to admit it felt good. Not just because I had won, but because, for the first time in a long time, the people around me weren't afraid to push back against the nonsense. Later that evening, as I sat in my garage, watching the sun set over my newly reclaimed driveway, I couldn't help but chuckle. What had started as a ridiculous battle over parking had ended with a full-scale neighborhood revolution. And all it had taken was one well-placed tank. As for Karen, she lasted another week before packing up and moving out. I never saw her again. The HOA, under new leadership, quietly erased most of her absurd rules, and life in the neighborhood finally started to feel normal again. And my driveway? Completely empty. Nobody ever parked in it again.